as have access to lots of different kinds of opportunities to make decisions, and to help prepare kids to be self-determined. And kids are really hardwired. I mean, adolescence is all about pushing families away, right? Or pushing parents away, and establishing that young adults' sort of ability to guide their own lives and make their own decisions, whatever the quality of those decisions might be. And we know that kids with disabilities have fewer opportunities to do that than their typically developing peers. So I think in the session before, someone asked a question about, can we continue, do brains continue to develop and decision-making get better? And I think probably, I would say throughout our entire lives, we learn from the opportunities to make decisions and to make mistakes. So some of the things to think about with kids are, how do we find those opportunities for kids with disabilities that their typically developing peers might have access to? So what are for young kids, the opportunity to do sleepovers, or go to a friend's house, or stay late after school. And then that brings up all sorts of opportunities to figure things out and develop some confidence around decision making. As kids get older, are there other community activities, after-school clubs, work shadowing experiences that might help facilitate decision-making for young adults? What kinds of community activities do they have access to? And as a parent of a child with CP, I know it was really, really hard to do those things because my son needed 24/7 support. And so how do we have the opportunity to have our kids do things without us so they have those opportunities? And how do we then, as parents, have those opportunities to experience that decision making on the part of our kids and develop our own comfort level with that and confidence in our kids' ability to make decisions? So thinking about that can be really helpful as we think about what the future looks like for our kids. And families may ask for help in thinking about, how do we set up those experiential opportunities to make decisions? So it could be as simple as thinking about or getting some guidance around, what are the things you do in your own home that you might offer decision-making opportunities, as simple as choosing clothes. So my son couldn't care less what he was dressed in and what he looked like. So when I held up the blue t-shirt and the red t-shirt, he had absolutely no opinion. But nonetheless, there might have been there were other things that we could be thinking about. But even from a really young age, what are those building blocks for decision-making so that young adults have that experience of in a sense, being self-determined in whatever aspect of their life they might be invited to do that. And then the last part I want to mention is this idea of tolerance for risk. So again, I think for parents here who may have teenagers, we know that our teenagers have a much greater tolerance for risk than their parents might have. But it's something that we all need an opportunity to explore. So these are pictures of my family, and when our kids are small, we hold them closely and we protect them, and our role is very different than it is as they get older. One of the things we were always worried about with my son was his ability to navigate safely in the community, and he seemed to have a particular affinity for culverts, and he more than once, and no matter how wide the road was, drove his chair off the side of the driveway and turned it over in a culvert. And this happened in a number of different settings. So not that I want him to have I wanted him to have the opportunity. That wasn't the consequence that I was looking for, but it gave both of us a greater sense of trust in each of our ability to explore what the community had to offer and to take some of those risks. So thinking about that as a family and as those who supports families is really important, because we're all worried about different things, but probably health and safety is way up there for most families, not necessarily for young adults. So exploring what are we worried about and what does that look like can be really helpful. So this is a conversation particularly important in the context of what happens when young adults turn 18. So under the law, all young people are legally considered an adult. They're presumed to be able to make decisions, manage their own affairs, enter into contracts, join the military, vote, marry, all kinds of different things. And that presumption isn't any different for someone with a disability. So if we are anticipating that a young adult might need decision-making supports, we want to be aware of what the range of options might be and to be thinking about this ahead of time in terms of what we think that might look like and what we want to do. So some of the things that families and those who support families can do to help is to start the conversation before a young adult turns 18. So just ask the family, have you thought about whether or not your young adult might need decision-making supports, and what are you thinking about in that regard? If you have access to information, it's a really nice time to share it. Physicians, school personnel are probably one of the most important places where families have contact with professionals who might be able to help with this conversation. So think about what information you might be able to share, and at the end of the presentation is a list of resources, both from a medical perspective and from sort of a community living perspective that you might be able to share with families. And as I was talking about, think about what are these learning opportunities, skill building opportunities that young adults can start to be participating to build self-advocacy skills, to explore self-determination, so that we can all get a better sense of what those decision-making abilities look like. So a lot of the discussion about supported decision-making in a national context is a reaction to guardianship. We've seen a steady increase in guardianship for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, even in the context of growing access to inclusive community opportunities, inclusive school opportunities, inclusive work opportunities. So there's been a really strong reaction and this sort of growing movement to really explore a much greater range of decision-making supports than guardianship. At the same time, we know that families are getting information which is guiding them in that direction more often than any other decision-making type of option. So for example, if you think about the people and places that families are going to be having conversations like this, we see, for example, that over almost 85% of school personnel are recommending guardianship before a discussion of any other type of decision-making support. Social services and medical professionals, which are other places that families are going to be, sort of having this conversation, often talk about guardianship before they talk about any other type of decision-making support. So while we have this sort of beginning change in the way that we think about supported decision-making and guardianship, we know that families are not necessarily getting a full range of information, so that sort of that train towards guardianship is continuing, and there's a shift, an effort to really try to shift the conversation. So supported decision-making is this idea that there are a whole lot of ways in which people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can be supported to make decisions. It's about relationships, legal arrangements, people who are in a person's life that can help them understand what they want to do and help guide them around decision-making. And nationally, it's really being talked about as an alternative to guardianship, is to enter into these and to really think about supported decision-making as an alternative. I would say that supported decision-making can happen no matter what decision-making tools are used. We want to make sure that we're always doing everything we can to understand what that individual's wishes and preferences are, whether there's guardianship or not. So just a little bit more about the big idea of decision-making. The information around brain development tells us that while we thought the brain, was sort of done developing at a fairly young age. We now know that it continues well into a person's 20s. 25 has sort of been a number that's bandied around. So should we want to sort of be thoughtful about making decisions about something like guardianship when someone turns 18, because their capacity to learn and grow is still significant, and their ability to make decisions will change. And we might reflect back on our own experiences as we grew up. How many of us were making really good decisions at 18, 19, 20? But we probably learned a lot from those decisions that helped guide us as we continued along our paths. So there's no reason why someone with a disability wouldn't also make less than stellar decisions at a younger age, but develop some of the skills needed to do that better. So this picture is one way to help guide a conversation and thinking about decision making, and this is specific to financial management or financial thinking about managing one's finances. So a person-centered planning process might look at the different things in a person's life that they might have access to, and look at their strengths, abilities, assets in each of those domains to engage in this case, financial management, using the tools that might be available to all of us in our communities as well as to that individual. So when you think about something like being concerned about someone not managing their money well, what is available to all of us to address that? So for example, can we set limits on our credit card account? Can we set limits on cash withdrawals from the bank? Can the bank provide some oversight about what's happening with an account, have an alert system that would then notify us if there was an issue? Can we use joint accounts so that a parent or family member might be able to help that young adult sort of monitor and manage their budget on a monthly basis and potentially intervene so that that account isn't overdrawn? So there's lots of tools that are available to all of us to help support decision making and to manage our lives that aren't necessarily about using legal tools such as guardianship to prevent things from happening, right? So we always want to be looking at what is that person's strengths. Do they like to use technology? Might they check their account every day? Or do they need some other support around financial, for example, management? So these are just some ideas for how to go about that conversation and thinking about it in this one domain that might broaden what the conversation looks like. So I'm going to talk now about just what are some of the actual tools available to us to support decision making. One of the ones that I found most important to be aware of is what's called a release of information or consent. So when a young adult turns 18, when they're 18 and 30 seconds, they are viewed differently under the law than when they were 17, 365 days and whatever. And one of the places that this matters a lot is around health care. So if there are people involved in that young adult's life, and often it's family members, who help with setting up doctor's appointments, making decisions about medical care, interacting with medical professionals, and that's important to continue, you have to do something. So while I may have had a relationship for 17 years with my son's specialist, neurologist, for example, that neurologist, even though they know our relationship, they trust me, they know my son wanted me to be a part of his life, they can no longer interact with me and share medical information. So you have to first be thinking, if you do nothing else, be thinking about what might the continuing involvement of family members or others, support people in that young adult's life, look like, and what do you need to make that happen? And this is true for any setting that you're interacting in. So it's healthcare settings, educational settings, vocational settings. All of those places are going to need you to sign, or your young adult, to give consent to you to still be part of the process. And then another level of designating who's involved and how they're involved are what are called powers of attorney. You can have powers of attorney for healthcare and finances. It's easy to do. The forms are available on the Department of Health Services website, and the link is at the end of this presentation. So powers of attorney also designate who might be part of making decisions around healthcare. So even if our child didn't have a disability, say they were in an accident and ended up in the emergency room and weren't able to communicate their wishes, you need somebody else to do that. So really we should all be doing powers of attorney for healthcare and probably finances, right? It isn't just about disability. And then, as we go sort of through the list of options, guardianship is one that is sort of the most consequential in terms of the impact on that person's right to make their own decisions and or the designation of other people to have the right to do that. The last one I want to just spend a little bit of time on are what are called supported decision-making agreements. So has anybody heard of those? Raise your hand. Great. So supported decision-making agreements were passed into law in Wisconsin last year. So it's brand new. And it lays out a way for an individual with intellectual developmental disability to say who they want to be the support people in their lives and what type of support those individuals can offer. So they say how they want that support person to interact with others in different settings and what role they want them to play. But it's the individual with the disability who is completing the form and designating who those people are. So, and agreements can be very flexible, but they do carry the weight of law. So if you're in a setting and you haven't yet encountered a supported decision-making agreement, you might want to find out how those are documented, for example, in the electronic medical record, and how you understand what authority is being given to that support person through a supported decision-making agreement. And as I said, the supported decision-making and supported decision-making agreements can be used in conjunction with any other type of supported decision-making tool, whether it's a release of information or guardianship. It can run the full gamut of both of those things interacting together. So because guardianship is so familiar, I want to talk just a little bit more about it. Again, sort of the national conversation is to really help us and ask us to start to think about this juxtaposition of human and civil rights that are guaranteed within our Constitution and the guardianship which removes many of those rights from an individual. And to rethink our immediate sort of advice to families when young adults turn 18 to automatically seek guardianship. One thing about guardianship is it doesn't have to happen at age 18. A family can explore other options and make a decision at some later date to pursue guardianship if they feel like that's needed. So there's not like a ticking clock for it, although many families are told 17 and 365 days you want to get in the court and get guardianship, but it doesn't actually have to happen immediately like that. So with guardianship, the court is involved. There's an attorney for the person with a disability called a guardian ad litem, as well as an attorney for the family, if that's who's seeking guardianship. And the court makes a determination of incompetence on the part of that individual. The court is supposed to consider if there are less restrictive alternatives available, such as some of the other tools that I had talked about, and increasingly there's education for judges and for attorneys on what this means, because there isn't really clear guidance in law about what that should look like. Guardianship can be temporary, although we know that typically when it's a decision of incompetence is made, it's much harder to reverse it than to sort of put it in place. So reversing guardianship is not something that is easy to do. And there can be guardianship of a person, of the estate, or full guardianship of everything. There's also the opportunity to limit guardianship. So you could say this individual still has the right to vote, to marry, to, you decide. It doesn't have to remove all of their rights to make their own decisions. But full guardianship does that. Basically says somebody else is designated with the right to do that, and can override that individual's choices about what they want to do with their life. One of the things that kicked off this discussion, wow, that's interesting, at a national level, I think I must have been working between two different versions of Word, of PowerPoint. Well, in any case, one of the things that kicked off this discussion at a national level was a case of a young woman with Down syndrome who was living in a group home and wanted to move into her own apartment. And her family opposed her wishes, and so she took it to court. And she eventually won her case and was able to reverse the guardianship, and she is now living in her own apartment with support. So that really kind of raised everybody's awareness about what is possible for people with disabilities and what people really can do when you start to look at young adults and their capabilities in our communities. The other thing about guardianship is it doesn't guard against bad decisions, right? It doesn't keep someone safe. We still can't do that even with guardianship. Young adults are still going to do things that will put them at risk. The court is supposed to look at what is that person's functional ability, not whether they make good or bad decisions, but their functional ability to understand choices, express their wishes about those choices. So if someone has no ability to express their wishes, that is concerning, and that might be a situation where we would be thinking about guardianship. But again, I think most people in my son's life would have said he isn't able to communicate his wishes, but people who knew him well could absolutely understand what his wishes were. He was very clear. He may have expressed them in different ways, but behaviors are certainly an expression of choices and preferences. So I want to talk just a little bit more about guardianship, since that's kind of the train we're trying to help us think more about and the thinking we're trying to shift. There are reasons that guardianship is important. So if a person is unable to make decisions and to give consent about what they want to happen to them in their lives, we need someone who can do that on their behalf, right? So particularly when you think about medical situations, I mean, there are lots of choices to make about whether or not to do something and whether or not to intervene. And as my son got older and he had opportunities to do surgeries that might improve his ability to function or just reduce pain, etc., more and more I began asking him, do you want to do this? You don't have to. It's your choice about whether or not you go through all the consequences of that. But if he weren't able to express that, then it's really important for those of us who need to do that on behalf of someone to do it in a very thoughtful and caring way. Similarly, along those lines, if someone is not able to exercise their rights, they need someone to help make sure that that happens, and to act as an advocate on behalf of that person if they can't do that for themselves. And to take action if that person is in a situation that isn't safe, or and to protect them from situations of abuse and neglect. So individuals need people in their lives who have the right to do that on their behalf if they can't do that for themselves. But there are also consequences to guardianship, both for the individual and for the way in which society sees that person. So a determination of incompetence can be really painful. I mean, think about so much of the experience prior to 18 can be a really strength-based approach. So our schools are helping young adults think about, what the future looks like and what they're able to do. Even starting in birth to 3, it's a very strength-based approach. Yet at 18, suddenly we're going to flip that and say, you are incompetent in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of society, and that can feel really bad. And that person may feel a loss of their own, self-respect, as well as the way in which society might look at them. So society might say, this person is less than because they are not considered competent to make decisions, and may interact with them in a very different way. Similarly, along those lines, if a person isn't aware of their basic rights, then and how to assert them, it can put them at greater risk for abuse or exploitation. And if we want someone to be able to say no, we also have to accept the fact that they may say no to things that we think might be important in their lives, right? But saying no is really important in whichever way a person is able to do that and express their wishes. And sort of back to this idea of decision-making as a learned skill, if a person doesn't have the right to make decisions and doesn't continue to have experiences in their lives which let them do that, they may both lose the self-confidence to do that, as well as the learning opportunities that might improve their decision-making. So all of this is just meant as a way to put a bunch of ideas out there for you to think about as you support families, and as families as you make decisions, or as individuals with disabilities as you make decisions about what does support look like as adults around decision making. And it's really individual. So not every person with the answer is different for every person who has cerebral palsy. No one person is exactly like another in this capacity, so it's a really individualized approach. These are a list of resources. I do want to point out we have a new issue brief through the Waisman Center on supported decision-making that goes into more detail about all of this and offers some resources. And there's also resources through the Waisman Resource Center around this topic as well. With that, I'll invite questions or comments from those who are here. Yeah.
Is there still a way to have some rights to do decision making, even if you have supported decision making, or the supported decision making people just do it for you, and you don't get any rights to do it?
Okay. So the question is there do you retain rights as an individual with a disability to make decisions when you're using supported decision-making agreements and some of these other tools? So I would say almost all of the tools completely retain the individual's right to make their own decision. The only one that changes that significantly is guardianship. So guardianship is the one where the court actually says this individual doesn't have the right to make some of the decisions in their life. But limited guardianship can also designate some of the rights that that individual retains as well. Okay? Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions on the release of information when you have a nonverbal child/adult? She has a total behind the box, but how do we, how does she fill that out so when she turns 18, we have the ability to still help with medical, et cetera?
Consent can be given in lots of different ways. So my son couldn't write, but he had a stamp with his name, right? And so in a setting where we were filling out a release of information, we'd fill it out, and then we could ask him, do you still want, and again, we want to use language that that individual understands. So, do you still want me to help you with your talk to your doctor? Is it okay with you if the doctor shares information? that individual can give consent in whatever way they communicate, right? It doesn't have to be verbal or written. And then they can sign in whatever way they would do that, whether it's a stamp, hand over hand, or there may be even other ways. Yeah, so there's lots of flexibility. The main point is that it's clear that they understand what they're giving consent to, yeah. In language they can understand, yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Paige.
Thank you. I think this is a really, really important topic for us to talk about, the transition to adulthood. For families who are trying to, so certainly like I can provide data if guardianship is the direction that a family wants to go. But if families are trying to figure out whether to pursue guardianship or go down a different path, is there a phone number that families can call, or a website, or I don't know, something that families can use to kind of explore different options?
So kind of all of these resources are a good starting point, so for example, I would encourage a family to call the resource center. There's a resource center that serves the entire, resource centers that serve the entire state, and the staff there are versed in this topic and can help sort of have a guided conversation with families. The Wisconsin Guardianship Support Center is another place to call where you can talk to someone and really explore some of the nuts and bolts. And I think, though, also thinking about other professionals in that family and child's life. So, talking with teachers who the family feels like know that child well, or medical professionals who might be able to help with that. And again, it's something to explore. So the family can try other types of tools and see what works. I think another thing to do that might be helpful at this time is what's called a futures planning process. So part of that can include looking at what that person's what everybody's concerns are, what that person's strengths are, and start to map what to do in these situations, and then try other things before potentially looking at guardianship. But unfortunately, someone asked, and I would actually like to explore the possibility, is there a decision-making tool that says, if this, then this, and help guide a family through that? I'm not aware of anything like that exists, but I'd also be cautious about it because everybody is so different. So take any disability, there's a really scattered skill set, and the consequences of that, it's really hard to know what the consequences of that scattered skill set are, right? Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I do with it is the doctor has to support me a lot of the time, being competency,
Yeah.
certified competency, which is not pleasant, but I like the people with disability to know what the issues are on that, and encourage people to look. It's published in the state of Wisconsin Cert Reports, and look at what the doctor's going to discuss, because some people have very strong feelings about voting or marriage, and they don't care about consent to participate in experimental medical treatment, which, the guardian probably needs to help more with that.
Right.
But then there's this middle category on that form, and I'm just wondering what the courts do. There's, yes, they need a guardian, no, they don't need a guardian, and yes, they could participate in this decision with guardian support. What does the court do with that middle category? Do you know?
So I'm thinking, so the question is, on the competency form that a physician fills out, there's a lot of different questions, and so Michael was suggesting in part it'd be interesting for anybody who is anticipating guardianship to actually know what the things on that form are. But I'm thinking, and then you asked about a middle category where there's options about what type of things that person can or can't do. So that's where I think limited guardianship comes in. So, for example, a person might decide to retain their right to vote, and might say, I don't care about consenting to medical treatment, or I want somebody else to make that to make that decision for me. So you can parse out what that person can continue to have the right to do and not.
The middle category with is like, yes, the person can make the decision, but only with the agreement with the guardian. And I don't know what that means. then there's this third one, but I never could understand how that was put into action by the courts on what the judge would do. It says they can make decisions in this area, but they're only effective if the guardian agrees. That sounds like,
Right.
oh, you don't have the right to do that to me, but, you know, the wording suggests that the individual has more rights halfway through there.
For some things that are,
It must be very confusing to the judge to read that, right?
I don't know. I would have to ask how judges handle that, but my basic understanding is that's where the limited or full guardianship decisions are made, is around those things. But that prompts me to go back and look at the form, and,
Because that's that new question that started about 8, 10 years ago,
Okay.
that they put that
Um,
intermediate category in there. It's not just yes and no, there's a space in the middle.
and I know they're also trying to add some additional questions that lead to this thinking around supported decision-making on the competency form, and I expect we'll be,
Again, the people doing this, you're just trying to do your best, but nobody really gives you any guidance on going through that, like what you're talking about. There's some better way to channel
Yeah.
people to the most appropriate answer for that individual.
there is work being done sort of across disability partners to provide education and training. It's real around sort of supported decision-making, but I think it would be really helpful to have one that focuses on physicians who are trying to fill out that form and add some additional clarification, because my understanding is you really don't get any support, but you ask Holly, what do you do when you get these forms and how do I fill it out? Some additional support might be really helpful.
That's what this is about, but I just at least include the person with disability in the
Yeah.
decision-making around these decisions, maximize their awareness of what we're doing. I worry that people have lives, won't even include the person with disability in any of the discussion.
I think you're right.
At minimum, the guardianship needs to be a joint process.
And then I think the conversation with physicians needs to also include the differentiation between shared decision-making and supported decision-making, because shared decision-making is kind of talked about, I think, in the medical world these days, with regard to just including the patient in the process of their care planning versus the difference with supported decision-making, because if they don't understand the difference, then that's going to impact what their decision is and how they proceed.
So the comment that shared decision-making is sort of a best practice in the medical profession, no matter who you're supporting, right? You want that patient to be as knowledgeable about what's happening and to engage in a discussion about what happens with their care. And that should happen no matter what, whether a person has guardianship or any other type of supported decision-making tool. But then you're right, there's actually legal documents that have a different, it's really about who makes the decision, not the discussion you have with the person about what's going to happen. So they are two very different things, yeah. Well, with that, thank you very much. I'm happy to chat afterwards if folks are interested, and I'll turn it over to Teresa to tell us what's next. Thank you.